I can't remember. I can't even remember our first point of contact. I can't remember how we made contact. Somehow we made contact. I feel like I might have seen your Instagram and you talking about dynos or something. I can't remember.
Possibly. I talk about dynos a lot.
That's the thing.
You know what I mean?
Well, this is the thing, right? And I thought it'd be interesting. I thought, look, usually, like, you'll start speaking, I'll be lost.
Oh, man.
So I thought today we might have a bit of time to sit down so you can actually talk about dynos because, look, we know, and funnily enough, going back to what you were talking about before, like people being able to give you whatever figure you want. Like, that still goes on today to a certain extent. Mate. Dynos can be cheated, and they are cheated. And there's a lot of different dynos too. Obviously, you've got hub dynos, you've got dynos that read at the wheel, you've got dynos that read at the crank, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you are probably, by listening to some of your let's call them rants or whatever you want to call them about dynos, right?
Oh, shuck.
You seem very knowledgeable when it comes to it. And do you want to talk us through your dyno setup and some common misconceptions with dynos, and just tell us about dynos, bro?
You know what it is with dynos? Like, for me, it's a tuning tool, right?
Yeah.
So you put a car on a dyno, you get a figure. How do you improve it? Calibration, software, hardware, increase that figure, right? The fundamentals of all dynos is horsepower and torque, right? Horsepower itself ain't measured on a dyno, by the way. No, horsepower is a calculation from torque.
Okay.
So all dynos actually measure torque.
Okay.
Mad, isn't it?
Okay. But you'd be right in that because am I right in saying it's a brake on the dyno that's applied, right? And it's the torque of your car that needs to fight against. Fuck it, mate. I'm gonna
typically, yes, you're right. Am
I getting there?
Yeah, you're getting there.
Okay.
More so than anyone else I've ever met. Do you know what I mean? Like,
that just hit me now. Like literally, I didn't know before, and that was just kind of working.
You know what it is to measure torque on a car, right? Ideally, you wanna stick a tow bar on it, stick it on a wall, and measure the torque it takes to pull that wall out, right? That's how you'd. You know, if you were to think about force, that's how you measure force, right? Or weight. Like if you were to have weighing scales, you put a weight on there and it will tell you by how much it pulls it. So you've got to understand that horsepower and torque itself, torque itself is a measure of rotational mass.
Okay.
Right? So wherever the rotating point is where you can measure it from. So when people say pounds per feet, what does that actually mean?
I have no clue.
You have no clue?
I'm still here, though. I'm still here. Okay. I'm with you. I have no clue.
So pound per feet in itself is how many pounds does it take to move that circular thing, whether it's the crank, whether it's a wheel, 1 foot.
Okay.
Do you get it?
Pounds per foot. Yeah.
Pounds per foot.
Cool. I'm going to edit that bit out. Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Pounds per foot.
So if you kind of think of a car, right, the ideal way to test any car is to take the engine out, stick the crank, the flywheel, onto an engine dyno and calculate that force, that pounds per foot. Where it comes into play is how many revolutions it does per minute, RPM, engine speed, in order to create that pounds per foot.
Okay.
So to measure it, in example, if you were to stick a spanner at the end of a crank and start the car, the spanner would spin, right?
Yeah.
You'd have to apply some sort of resistance to it. To stop it, which will be your measure of torque. Now, horsepower itself was actually, we're going back to the 1600s. James Watt, he derived horsepower by, how many horses does it take to turn a mill in a factory in comparison to like a steam engine?
Interesting.
So when he was calculating,
is that where horsepower comes from?
That's where it comes from, yeah. So he's like, okay, so it takes 1 horse, 15 minutes to turn this mill, and in comparison, my steam engine does that in a second. Like that rotational force. So that's where the horsepower comes from. But it's all still derived from torque, right? The relationship between torque and horsepower is a simple calculation. So he came up with that calculation, which was, okay, we've got a rotational mass, we've got the torque, right? What we'll do, we'll times the rotational mass by the torque, rotational speed by the torque, and divide it by a number 5252. Have you heard that number before? So it's it's a constant.
Okay.
And the reason why people put constants in mathematic formulas is because it tells you what every other part of that formula does, right? Okay. So the outcome is your horsepower. So if you look at a dyno graph, 4,000 RPM makes 500 pounds per feet of torque, times 4,000 RPM by 500 pounds per feet of torque, divided by 52. Look above the graph, you'll see that's the horsepower.
Interesting. Okay.
Have we got an example?
So-
Have we got an example? Yeah.
Have you? So literally, you wouldn't even. As soon as you see the torque on the graph, at what particular RPM, you can do this calculation.
Well,
with
that's what the
calculator.
dynos do.
But you could
You could, yeah. So it's to see if a dyno has been drawn up or measured, that's the only way you're going to know. Do this calculation, and wherever that horsepower lies, if it's way off, you know that's been drawn on Excel or some shit, right?
Are people doing that?
Mate, you were
Of
surprised.
course, bro. Stranger things have
Oh,
happened.
fucking hell,
Man's
mate.
just photoshopping graphs.
Oh, mate, people are doing some mad shit. Mad shit. So, yeah, when it comes to kind of, dynos, so I don't want to lose anyone.
No,
in this, by
bro.
the way,
This is
because,
really
like,
interesting.
this
It's
is crazy.
intriguing, bro. You had
Yeah.
me. Keep going.
Yeah, so there's different types of dynos, right? And everyone has this kind of fundamental, how much power does it make at the crank? Nobody ever knows, right? Unless you take the engine out. But you do know, because like, if BMW, for example, said the new M3 came, 500 brake horsepower from the factory, you've gone to a dyno jet roller, right? And you've pulled on that car and it's made 480 wheel horsepower.
So there's 20 brake.
20 brake
Drivetrain
loss, drivetrain loss. And what's your drivetrain? Your drivetrain is your drive shaft, your diff, your gearbox, your 2 half shafts, and your wheel, right? So, quite simply, you can work out the wheel loss on that car.
So
Now-
everyone saying you never know it's at the crank until you take the engine out. Or sorry, you never know what power it really is unless you take the engine out.
Yeah.
You do.
Kind
can.
of, yeah.
Closely, anyway.
So-
Quite close.
So Dynojet themselves as a brand said, okay, we're going to make a dyno after everyone else has made a dyno, by the way. Like Dynojet was one of the later ones. We're going to make a dyno and we're going to measure wheel horsepower simply by wheel torque.
Okay.
Right? So we know the torque. We use the same methods to measure this torque, which is one roller, tires go on it, apply a force, measure the torque. And it does that by a strain gauge. Well, it's a load cell, right?
Okay.
Do you know what a load cell is?
I know what strain gauge is.
Yeah, well, so a load cell is, them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So same method, right? So it kind of force in, force out, and that's what it measures.
Okay.
So all dynos are equipped with load cells in the modern day, and that's what measures the force.
Okay.
So whether it's rotational force, which is transferred from the cylinder to that load cell, that's how it measures it. The beauty of that load cell is it can measure the force applied, and it can measure the force unapplied. So if you see dyno pulls and you see at the end of the dyno pull, the guy puts it in neutral, doesn't leave the car in gear, puts it in neutral, and you're waiting for the car to come down all the way.
Isn't that where isn't it on the rundown that it measures the losses?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how many dynos have you been on that measures the losses on the rundown?
1.
And that's the latest one you've been on.
That's the latest one.
Amazing.
And that's
innit?
the only reason I know that.
Yeah.
But again, I only know that because I've been told that at that dyno. So I
Exactly.
couldn't say that other dynos aren't doing it, but it's the only one I'm aware of.
So the other dyno that you use most regularly,
Okay, yep.
it doesn't have that ability to do it,
Okay.
but it's got a database of cars, so it knows
Interesting.
what it is. So what that does is shortens down the tuning time, shortens down the data time, data acquisition.
Okay.
So then they
So
use
it's almost assuming that my car is the same as the other models.
yeah.
Whereas
Same
I could-
tires, same brakes, everything, right? So don't forget, obviously, if you put 40-inch wheels on your car and put it on the dyno,
Damn, you just told people my next mod, bro. That's a 40-inch spinner.
you'd have greater transmission loss, right? Because more rotation, more loss, more friction, etc. So in kind of essence, like there are many different types of dynos, but there's only a couple of dynos that can measure that transmission loss or measure it to a degree where it's most accurate.
It was the Maha that I was on.
Yeah, so
recently.
Maha use very much the industry standard of, when we say industry standard, one of the most respected standards of kind of measuring power and torque, which is what we use. We use a Bar Pro, which is based upon a Maha system, which is exactly the same.
Okay.
Uses a load cell, dyno. It kind of, measures on the way up and it measures on the coast down.
Got it.
So when it comes to kind of, the dynos itself, obviously you've got single roller. So the last one you went on was single roller,
Mhm.
wasn't it?
No, I don't think so. What, the Maha?
So did your tyre go
Yamaha
in
was-
between two rollers, or did it?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
It was 4 single rollers.
Yeah, so-
as opposed to 2 rollers and a tyre sitting in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
single roller.
the problem with tyre sitting in the middle is it has a tendency to creep.
Pull off. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've probably seen that.
Yeah.
And the problem with it creeping is it reduces the amount of inertia, which then inflates the end figure.
Got you.
But Yamaha came away from that double roller setup because a lot of their dyno operators were coming off the back roller and they were inflating figures. So Yamaha then went single roller. So now all,
Dynojet runs single too.
so Dynojet run single as well.
But they don't measure the loss on
They
the
don't.
down.
It can do though. This is what I'm trying to tell you. So every guy who owns a Dynojet with WinPep, which is the software that runs it, it can actually measure that.
But why don't I utilize that?
The reason being is because once you go single roller on a dyno, you have a high wheel horsepower because there's less friction, less loss, right? Measured at the drum, which is the load cell. So as soon as you go from a Mustang, do you know what a Mustang dyno is? Old school.
I've heard Mustang dynos read really high. No?
Really low, really low.
Oh, are they the heartbreakers?
Yeah, they're the heartbreakers. Simply because they only measure wheel horsepower, not flywheel horsepower.
Got you.
Do you get it?
Mhm.
They have no ability to measure the flywheel horsepower
Okay.
with parasitic load cells.
Okay.
Right. So the Mustangs came along and they were predominantly the world's dyno, right? They were the biggest manufacturers and they were like, okay, this is the wheel horsepower. If it came from the factory with this and this is what we're measuring it, then this is the loss. So we'll make a full database of all the losses that we can measure on all the cars and all different types. So they were the industry standard at the time. Then Yamaha came along, VTEC, Bapro, and they were like, yeah, we're going to use this new type, which is, calculating parasitic loss. The biggest misconception, regardless of what dyno you use, right, is the percentile loss.
What's the percentile loss?
So typically Dynojet. We're talking Dynojet. So Dynojet themselves say our wheel horsepower is called Dynojet wheel horsepower. It's not.
Oh, so it's not like it's like their own.
Yeah, so you get a 4-roller setup like a Mustang. You've got a lot of heat, a lot of traction, a lot of friction. It's going to have a very low wheel horsepower because it's measuring on high inertia, right? Dynojet doesn't. It almost freewheels. There's hardly any resistance to it. So if you go on a Dynojet, your pull's about 5 seconds, right? What?
Yeah.
Right? So your losses are low. So your wheel horsepower is going to be high.
Okay.
Right? So I'll give you an example. I use the M3 again, right? So the M3, 500 horsepower from factory. Dynojet ran 480. Your 20 horsepower loss.
Okay.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If now we tune the car, we get 1,000 horsepower from the car. 1,000 wheel horsepower. Right? What are you making at the flywheel?
What are we making? Should we make 960? No, because it's double the power, so double the losses. No?
Let me say that again. So
Man's putting me in a match. He's putting me on a spot.
So 480 wheel horsepower your M3 has made, right?
Yes.
And your drivetrain loss is 20
20%.
horsepower.
20 horsepower.
So this is where I'm going to go back
so,
to the
so this
percentile
is what I
loss.
was saying though, right? So surely if you're doubling the power, no, you don't. No, in fact it's 980 because it's
Okay,
the
say
same
it.
drivetrain loss.
Hang
yeah?
on a minute. Let me make it easier for you. So I made
He's
480 wheel
exposing me,
horsepower.
guys. He's exposing me.
I've made 480 wheel horsepower on a Dynojet with my G80 M3. I've now made 980 wheel horsepower tuned.
Yes.
Full forged,
Yes.
whatever it is, yeah? How much flywheel do you think I've got?
You should have 1,000.
You should have,
Yeah.
which is amazing, right?
Yeah.
You only know that now.
Uh-huh.
In the real world, what would they say?
What? Oh, yeah. They're going to say it's loads of... Yeah, because...
Why?
Because I don't know, because there's industry standard percentages, isn't there?
Why?
I don't know, because people talk about 10%, 15%, 20%. I don't know. It should always be the same, right? It's the beginning.
So yeah, the drivetrain loss is a constant. Remember I
Yeah.
said the 52 is a
yeah.
constant? There also, another constant is transmission, drive shafts, wheels, tyres.
Of course.
Obviously, if you don't massively change them, and they're the same kind of circumference, then your wheel horsepower and your flywheel horsepower difference is always going to be fixed to a degree. We're not saying exactly.
Okay, yeah. So why is it a percentage then?
So now let's work percentages.
Don't make sense.
So
If what you're
if you've
saying is
got- if
right,
you-
the percentage...
Yeah, so
drop off, don't-
if you've got 480 wheel horsepower now, and you say you've got a 20, no, let's make it easier for you.
Make it easy for me, bro.
500 wheel horsepower I've
Yes.
made on the Dynojet.
Yes.
You saying I got a 20% loss.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've made how much at the flywheel?
Bro, you've got 600.
600.
600 brake.
It doesn't sound too bad, does it? It's 100 horsepower loss, right? It's not huge,
No.
right? But it's a bit daft, right?
Yeah.
Car's made 500 wheel horsepower. You're saying there's 100 brake horsepower loss, 600 horsepower. I'll tell you what sounds even more daft.
Yeah.
I've now made 1,000 horsepower wheel horsepower.
You got 200 brake loss. Now, wouldn't it be? Would it be?
Exactly.
If you're running the same percentage.
So,
But yeah, hang on. How are you losing more?
So how do you lose? How do you increase the transmission loss on a car when you're making more power?
All right, here's my flip side, yeah, and my completely uneducated comeback to a little bit of that, yeah.
Go on.
Heat's
yeah? One factor.
Right? So heat is energy, which energy is power,
or
whatever. The more power your car's making, more heat that components perhaps produce.
Okay, so
losing a little, but it's only going to be minor, right?
Okay, so you got 5W40 engine oil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at 500 horsepower, your oil is going to be a certain viscosity. You add heat to it. Does that oil get thinner or thicker?
Gets thinner. Oh, sure, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it gets thinner. Yeah.
What happens to the gearbox fluid?
Yeah, thinner. Okay. So basically, you're saying everyone's doing it wrong. But is it everyone's doing it wrong?
No, I
or
don't
is
think
it,
so. Look,
is it
credit where credit's due? Look, there's guys in the industry that literally stick to the wheel horsepower.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, I made 500 wheel horsepower, I made 600 wheel horsepower tuned.
The rest
made
is a guess.
The rest is a guess.
Yeah.
But no, your dyno has the ability to actually kind of come up with a figure. You're just not happy to use it.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. So, wow. So generally, and is 20%, sorry, not 20%, but let's say 500 brake horsepower and then make it 500 brake at the crank and then only making 480 at the wheel. So is a 20% just a made up, sorry, not 20, a 20 brake horsepower loss, just something you've done for an example? Is that quite real? Is it like a 20?
That's definitely real if you've got a low friction gearbox like a ZF8.
Like only 20 brake horsepower for the drivetrain.
But then you add another 2 rollers to that dyno, increase the amount of friction, right? You've got now less wheel horsepower because the amount of heat generated, the amount of traction generated, you're now measuring at a lower rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Basically, the more load, the more friction, the slower your car will be generally, right? So if you add some more wheels to your car, what happens?
Yeah, your car's going to get...
It's going to get slower, right? So generally, that's the kind of rule of the thumb. And, you know, this is no disrespect to any of the tuners out there, right? And I say this, you know, openly, like, if you don't know, you don't know. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
But if you want to know, there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of books you can read to educate yourself and make yourself a better person by understanding your tool, right?
Yeah, 100%.
But
so would you say that your figures on your, not your only dyno, but people who run the same dyno as you, the Mahas too, and things like that, they're more accurate? Using that rundown, they're a more accurate.
I think so.
At crank figure.
Yeah, definitely.
Because the wheel is the wheel.
Yeah.
The rest is a guess if you're using percentages, kind of.
But I mean, you could go on a dyno, like you could have a dyno run, and the guy could leave the car on. Like if you go to an independent dyno, or you go to another tuner's dyno, right? The guy could leave your car running for half an hour, increasing temperatures, and reduce that dyno pool in terms of power. Do you get it? So any dyno pool that we do, whether it's our own cars, whether people want to get a dyno run, we always data log it, and we'll say, look, on this day, our fan speed was this, air pressure was this, humidity was this, and this is what car produced.
Okay.
That's simply what it is.
Yeah.
So there's many factors that can affect the power and the torque of the car, mainly kind of environmental factors. And some dynos do take that into account, so it will give a more average kind of result at the end of it. So there's different standards, SAE, DIN. There's loads of different calculations to take into account weather correction. So you're probably seeing it on some dynos, WCF, weather correction factor. So some dynos...
I know this, like the temperature and the atmospheric pressure that day or whatever the hell is adjusted.
Yeah.
Or you're meant... Right, a lot of dynos, you're meant to adjust before you start. But people leave the... Would I be right in saying a way of cheating a dyno is like you can leave the wrong kind of inputs, like, you know, the temperatures and...
Yeah, I mean, it depends what dyno. There's so many different dynos out there. But generally, a dyno that's locked out, like our dyno, BioPro, you can't change any settings.
It does it.
Yeah, it's got a weather station.
Okay.
And it's got a computer. and it just whatever you measure is what you measure. And the reason for that is because, you know, if someone was to come, industry personnel, and says, hang on a minute, what you're producing is false. Come, dissect the whole dyno, see if there's anything wrong with it. It's like if you went to a market, man, you bought some potatoes, right? You went to a guy and he put them potatoes on a weighing scale and he had a false weight. It's charging you more for that potato. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, for real.
That's what's happening with dynos. Dynos are the measuring tool. They are the medium for measurement of power and torque. Some people, like I had a conversation on Facebook the other day. Don't get me started on Facebook and Facebook
I'm not even
groups
on it,
and
bro.
stuff.
I'm not even bothering.
Bro, I'm telling you, like, I had a conversation with someone the other day. Like, dynos don't matter. They don't
It's
matter.
all about road tuning.
It's all about draggy. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, yeah, tell that to my solicitor 3 months ago.
Right?
Do you know what I mean? Like, 3 months ago, yeah? Tell that to my solicitor. Draggies are amazing.
Okay. What you got?
So what's that, 100 to 200 kilometers in Mexico?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that don't really.
Do you know what I mean?
work in UK. Do you know what, right? I actually feel dumb speaking to you, bro.
Nah, don't say it.
But no, listen,
come
no,
on.
do you know what it is, right? It's your thing. It's what you do. And it's really interesting hearing someone speak about it passionately, but
Yeah.
informatively.
Yeah.
And also, I don't feel like it's not like you're overcomplicating things. You're saying things very straight.
Mate, I try so
and
hard
I'm
to
learning.
speak in layman's
Don't get me
terms.
wrong. I am kind of I'm in and out. I'm trying to hold on, but I don't think you're making it complicated. And what we've came to now has made sense to me. So I'm a little bit more.
So if you go back a couple of years
Yeah.
to your dyno pools at XYZ tuning or whatever it was, now you apply that science to that, you will now see more normality in your results.
Okay.
So I beg you after this, yeah?
I'm thinking like, how many times I've been on what dyno and this, that, the other. No, but definitely it does make you think. And I'll definitely be thinking that at the next, or thinking about what you said. And you know, I'm going to be in contact with you, bro. I'm going to be like, look, bro, this made this a deal. What is it?
I am not the dyno police, right? I'm not here to
no.
kind of shout anyone out or kind of rumble anyone's, business. But at the end of the day, look, if you've got a tool, you need to know how to use it. You need to understand how it works, and you need to be an expert in that.
But do you find this is the problem, right? I would say there's too many people, it seems, going off what we're talking about, that don't know how to use the dynos, now becoming the majority, and the minority no one cares about, because the guys doing it right, they're the minority. Like, you know what I mean? Everyone's going off the majority who are doing it wrong and using all these weird calculations that is now kind of industry standard calculations and taking it as the gospel.
Yeah.
So that's almost now that what counts. Is that?
It's a shame because, like, every industry, every business, every kind of entity, like food industry, they've got standards, haven't they? They've got kind of a governing standard, almost like a policing of their system. The tuning industry has none.
No, you're right.
There's no one saying, like, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. Actually, this is against the law. You shouldn't be lying to your customers.
Yeah.
Do you get it? Like, there is none of that. And that's because the actual tuning industry isn't taking that seriously.
Yeah.
But it's a massive industry. It's a massive...
It's true. Bro, we
massive
should be the fucking tuning police, bro. Let's do
tuning
this.
police.
Let's do this.
Man.
Coming soon to check out your dyno, me and Mabz.
Oh, man.